This is Elena Wagner on April 11th at around 2:30 p.m. with Shane Boyle. So Shane, when and where were you born?
I was born in Newport Beach, California, August 4th, 1982.
And where were your parents born?
My dad was born in Tennessee. I have to think about that because his family was living in England at the time because his dad was there for the military right after World War II. My mom was born in Southern California in Burbank.
Cool. And did your parents go to college?
They did.
Cool. Would you say that your family was political when you were growing up?
I think everyone's political. But I mean, my dad volunteered for the Marines in the late 60s. He supported Vietnam, and so, they've been political, but not in the way that I'm political, neither ideologically nor forms of political engagement that I prefer.
Do you remember when you first got involved in political action and what stimulated your involvement?
Yeah, it was probably in high school. The first real demonstration that I went to was right before my senior year. It was the 2000 Republican National Convention, or was it Democrat? Republican, I believe, in Los Angeles. And that was, quite a jolt being 17 or 18 and getting hit with tear gas and seeing friends get shot with rubber bullets outside of in the United States. That was a very intense experience. But before that, I had been, my political education had started, primarily through music and being involved in different music scenes in Orange County, and so that was a good introduction to different political views. Growing up in Orange County, which is where I grew up, the most probably conservative county in all of California, you're indoctrinated in a certain way, so there are very few avenues for kind of thinking beyond what you're, raised into.
Yeah. And so what are you doing now at UC Berkeley?
I'm getting my PhD in performance studies, and my project roughly focuses on late 1960s in West Germany, looking at the relationship of performance and political violence. Cool.
Occupy Wall Street started last September in New York City. What was your first involvement with Occupy?
To take a step back, Occupy Wall Street started in the fall, but there is kind of what some people are calling the prehistory of Occupy that's really important to attend to. So I'd say actually my first involvement was a few years ago in kind of the occupation movement that started at the UC in 2009, 2010, and a lot of the ideas and documents that were produced out of that movement. It's well known now that, adbusters and the people that called for Occupy Wall Street, were very much influenced by some of that stuff. So I'd say actually my involvement was a couple of years prior to that, but, the actual, real Occupy movement, I got interested when I heard, I guess it was August of last year, that there was going to be Occupy Wall Street, and then there's going to be its, a similar event taking place in San Francisco called Occupy the FIDI, Occupy the Financial District, which I don't think ever panned out, or maybe a dozen people came out. And so friends and I were talking about that and what we wanted to do with that. But at that same time, we were planning a day of action on September 22nd, I believe, that ultimately became the Tolman Hall occupation at UC Berkeley. And so, the arrests and things that happened out of that day kind of derailed any kind of interest or ability to take part in Occupy the FIDE, which I think was September 24th. But then I really became involved in Occupy when Occupy Oakland started. I think it was early October 10th or 9th, I forgot when.
Yeah, so can you describe your involvement in Occupy Oakland?
Yeah, it was pretty marginal for the most part. I wasn't camping there, but the day the tents went up that Monday, I was out there with a bunch of friends and hundreds of others, and was super excited when people started just putting up tents on no pre-planned cue or anything. People just started putting up tents and self-organizing, and it was really inspiring to see. I was having a conversation with a group of friends, and one friend was like, hey, I think we need a supply tent. You know what, I'm going to go find a tent and make that the supply tent, and people can bring stuff and provide supplies. I was like, oh, that's how this stuff works. That's a great, a way to build community and work on kind of building this encampment. So I went to a number of the early General Assemblies, and then I was, getting more and more involved on things on campus and discussions about how to start Occupy Cal. So that kind of took the time away that I could have devoted to Occupy Oakland by focusing on stuff at Berkeley. But I live about a mile or two from Oscar Grant Plaza, so I was there pretty frequently with friends, going to GAs, taking part in certain discussions. When Occupy Oakland was first attacked by police and I guess dismantled, the next day I was out there with everyone else as cops were hitting us with tear gas and shooting people in the head with beanbag bullets and all that stuff. So, and then I was also very much involved in the general strike that happened on November 2nd and basically all the series of actions that have happened since. I was arrested on January 28th during Move-In Day, which was a day that Occupy Oakland activists decided to kind of reemerge and rather than encamp, to actually take an unused building owned by a corporation and to try to make it into a social center. And unfortunately, along with 400 other people, I was arrested that night just for, actually heading back to the plaza after we had, gone on multiple marches that day. So,
can you describe what goes through your head when you're seeing people around you getting tear gassed and shot at with beanbag bullets?
I mean,
what makes you stay?
The way that I kind of grew up or came of age as an activist was really kind of through this model of going to things like this with friends that you trust and who support you and that you support, and what a lot of people call affinity groups. And so what keeps me there are the 7-8 other friends who are there and who we're all looking out for each other, and we all have different interests and reasons for being there, but above all we're trying to make sure that none of us get hurt or arrested or anything like that. So I mean, when they shoot off tear gas, whether it's here in Oakland or in Germany, I've been involved in things like this. It's you really you're looking out for your friends and trying to make sure that everyone's together. And then when things kind of clear, and if anyone's kind of been lost in the fray, you get a hold of them and try to find them. And so it's really that kind of solidarity is what kind of immediately pops into mind, and it becomes almost instinctual, especially because these are your really good friends. They're not just people that you organize with, but they're friends that you go have beers with, who you have really strong relationships to. And I think that's super, super important. I've been, especially traveling so much and doing research on protests and demonstrations in Europe. There's a tendency oftentimes for people that aren't necessarily connected to the local terrain and struggle to go to things by themselves. And that's it's a different experience going to a protest by yourself as opposed to going with friends. So it's really something I prefer, to go with people there. So that's what keeps me there, and that's what probably immediately pops into mind, to make sure none of my friends are getting hurt.
Yeah. What was it like being arrested that night on January 28th?
It was really boring. Yeah, I mean, it was a pain because we actually, all of us were on our way home. One of my friends who was arrested that night was actually calling another of our friends who just went to get his car to pick us up, or to pick her up, and I was going to go and get my bike. And so we were actually getting ready to go home. We were just a couple of blocks from the plaza where everyone was going to meet and disperse. Then all of a sudden, I think people got a little bit had become resigned to the fact that the night was ending. So people that were out there scouting and making sure that we knew where the police were and everything kind of had perhaps decided not to fulfill their duties, or people just thought that maybe the night was over, because in Oakland there hadn't been really massive attempt at kettling protesters before, but all of a sudden we're just a couple blocks away and we see a line of riot cops in front of us blocking off one of the blocks, the block ahead of us, and then looking behind us and we're like, oh, there's another line of riot cops who are blocking off our other exit. There's no other way to get out, and so I personally did not want to get arrested that night. We hadn't planned or prepared for it, and so the group that I was with, we decided to stay on a sidewalk across the street from the YMCA where a bunch of people were starting to enter. Some people, I think, thought that that was the target of the occupation that night, and other people were just kind of getting scared and wanted a way out. So we actually, following what usually the law says to do, if you don't want to become involved, get on a sidewalk across from where the conflict is probably going to emerge. So we did that, and then all of a sudden cops were saying, no, you have to go over by the YMCA. Like, oh, that's weird. And then they started pushing us into a smaller and smaller corner, a few hundred of us, and were ordering us to disperse, but not letting us disperse, beating people back that were trying to leave. It wasn't that much fun. And then we ended up getting carted off to jail, all 409 of us. And luckily I was, I got to go to a jail in downtown Oakland, Glendyre, and not Santa Rita, which is the jail that's really far away in Dublin, I think. And so I actually got out, after about almost a day, which was way, way better than a lot of people who had to stay in jail for 2 or 3 days just in a holding cell, not even with bunks or anything.
Did you get separated from your friends?
It's complicated. For 2 reasons. One reason, when we saw that there was no way of getting arrested, a good friend of mine and we decided, okay, well, might as well get this over with and, volunteer ourselves to be, some of the first arrested, be on the first bus, because maybe then we'll go to Glendyre, which is in downtown Oakland, rather than Santa Rita. So that kind of sucks because we knew what was going on and other people didn't, and we tried communicating that to people. So I was able to go with one friend. She's actually transgender, and so she was on the bus with me in the section reserved for men. It's very, gender specific, the jails. And so when we got on the bus we got to be together, which was nice, and then when we got to the jail, actually, we got separated, which was a shame. And, it sucks when you have a friend that you care about and gets taken away from you. But it actually turned out really well in the end, because the first cell I was in was with a bunch of people I didn't know, and actually ended up not really, they were activists, but what they were talking about and kind of some of their opinions I didn't totally agree with, and it was making for some tense situations between people in the cell. Luckily, in the end, some friends, some acquaintances actually ended up being put in the cell with me, which is super nice and made for, a much nicer time. And jail is actually a really great place to meet people and to make friends and relationships and all of that stuff. But yeah.
Cool. That's a really interesting story. So the occupation began in earnest, as I understand it, in early November on UC Berkeley campus. Mm-hmm. Can you describe your involvement with Occupy Cal?
Yeah, so at the start of this year in August, a large group of maybe 60 people, about that, gathered at the UAW office, which is the union, the labor union for academic student employees, primarily grad students at the UC. And we met for what was called a resistance social, a way for people coming back from summer break to see friends and kind of start planning what we wanted to do for the year and to get things started. And so out of that came the first day of action on September 22nd, which turned into the Tolman Hall occupation. And then within that, first meeting, what we called the resistance social emerged a couple of different groupings, the main one being this public education coalition, a really kind of bad, complicated, bureaucratic name for a group, but it was kind of this idea of the coalition was kind of representative of a change that was happening at Berkeley, whereas before things had been incredibly sectarian, organizing on campus, big differences between various socialist and Trotskyist groups, different kind of anarchist or anti-authoritarian strains, certain a certain Maoist group that I'll leave unnamed, and just other kind of liberal groupings, people unaffiliated. It was really a sectarian, but for the first time in a while, it seemed like there was like a lot of like interest in people really working together, and so we kept meeting throughout October, and people started planning. Occupy Cal came up with the idea, hey, we might as well, all these occupations are going on all over the place. We have some experience with trying to occupy space on campus and using that as a form of action to communicate our struggle, meet each other, try to put up with some like visual embodied resistance to what's happening to public education. So we might as well start our own encampment. Someone had the clever idea of, rather than calling it Occupy UC Berkeley, to come up with much pithier name of Occupy Cal. And the date that was picked was November 9th, which is just about a week after the general strike in Occupy Oakland. I mean, this is planned before general strike in Occupy Oakland, and the idea was to have a demonstration, a rally, which was a really great rally. A lot of people came out to it on Sproul Plaza. And then there was a march just basically around the block. Refund California, which is kind of a statewide grouping backed by ACE, which is formerly ACORN. They kind of organized this protest outside of Bank of America and Telegraph. That was, I don't know, it was kind of a weird action. But, so there was that, there was a march, a protest outside of this bank, and then people came back for a general assembly on Sproul. The group almost unanimously voted to start an encampment and agreed to certain demands that we wanted to make. And almost immediately when people started putting up tents on the north lawn, a number of police came in and took the tents that had been set up and took people's possessions that were on the ground. More tents were put up, and police again, when police again tried to take the tents, hundreds and hundreds of people linked arms and tried to protect the tents, which resulted in Alameda County Sheriff and UCPD beating a lot of people, really, really hurting people. I suffered a bruised, maybe broken rib. I never went back to make sure. They don't. There's nothing you can do about a broken rib, so they didn't have an X-rays. But so a number of people were hurt that day. About 40 people were arrested. Those there who took part in kind of this attempt to protect the tents and stand up for their right to free speech and assembly succeeded and were able to keep some of the tents up. Later that night, around 9:30, I think 9 or 9:30, even more police officers from Oakland PD, Alameda County Sheriff, and UCPD came back and again started really, really beating students, faculty, community members, anyone who was out there, and succeeded in taking the rest of the tents. And that prompted just a huge, huge turnout that evening in a general assembly, at which point a friend of mine floated the idea of, hey, let's hold a student strike next week to protest this. And the student strike happened a week later, which was probably one of the most amazing kind of days of action that I've been involved in. There were the SF Chronicle that typically plays down the number of people that take part in things, estimated a crowd of 10,000 people that night. So the culmination of this long day of action, which included Open University marches, and talks by Robert Reich and some other kind of local poets and activists, and a culminating General Assembly and the re-encampment of re-establishment of Occupy Cal. Was a really, really amazing day. Yeah.
Has your involvement in Occupy Cal been at all affected by the violence that you experienced?
Not really. I mean, by now, if you're an activist in the U.S. who's interested in actually going to demonstrations and taking part in direct actions and stuff, you kind of, you learn to not to handle, but to work with and go with it, and you kind of unfortunately have to expect it from the police. So that hasn't been what has affected my relationship with Occupy Cal. I actually, took part in Occupy Cal for a few weeks, about a month, and then, after Occupy Cal, actually, to back up, a couple of days after the student strike, after it was established for the second time, is dismantled again by police. And for the rest of the semester, people maintained a constant presence out there. People slept out there without tents. There was one night a sleep out right before Thanksgiving, which was a lot of fun, when people put up tents just temporarily for a night and we were allowed to be out there. But as the semester wound down, my participation and the participation of a number of people that had been really active in trying to get it set up started to wane for various reasons. A lot of us were really exhausted. A lot of people had started directing energy back into Occupy Oakland. And there were also, extreme differences of opinion, oftentimes political, sometimes personal differences that, started to arise within and around Occupy Cal that, made the space not as attractive as it had been to people earlier. So.
Would you be able to share what some of those differences were?
Yeah, it's, there are a number of things that came up, differences of opinion over organizing styles, what we wanted. Some people really were putting an emphasis on the form of the occupation and the encampment. And at least in my opinion, there started to be less of a good understanding of where we wanted to go with this. And I myself was really happy to support the occupation in the ways that I could, but there was other work that, I wanted to take part in. And so, that's partially political, also trying to figure out how I spend my time and use the limited time that I have. Also, there became the Occupy Cal, encampment and General Assembly, which is essentially what Occupy Cal became. It became a almost daily General Assembly. It became really procedural, and people started getting hung up on the form of the General Assembly and the form of the encampment, and not really thinking in terms of content or technique and things like that. And it's something, I'm totally happy to support, and I've continued to support Occupy Cal, but it's not a place that I was going to be putting a lot of my time into. And so I got involved with, one thing that came out of Occupy Cal and Occupy Davis, and Occupy UCLA, Occupy some of the other Occupy movements at universities around the state, was an idea of, hey, we should start Occupy Education, which was a movement centered around trying to address the cuts to public education in California. And, there was some coordination with other Occupy education groups in other states. So that's something I started putting my time into more in late December, as well as, taking part in more things with Occupy Oakland. And then when the semester started again, I continued somewhat with Occupy Education, although that started going in a certain path that I wasn't as excited about. I've decided to, start focusing my attention more again on actual UC Berkeley campus and organizing events for March 1st, which was the next day of action. This happens all the time in activism, especially when there's so much going on that there are almost too many projects. And that's a great thing to have to deal with. There are so many projects going on that you really only have to realize that you only have so much time, especially when you're a student and a teacher and applying for jobs and all of this stuff, that you really have to kind of pick and choose, and oftentimes hard choices have to be made over what you dedicate your time to, because you can support things and verbally support things, but the time that you spend going to meetings is not insignificant.
So I understand that you weren't arrested on November 9th, but you faced charges after the fact. Mm-hmm. Could you tell me a little bit about what happened there and what that process was like and how you've dealt with it?
Yeah, so on November 9th, like I said, around 40 people were arrested that day, oftentimes for very kind of arbitrary reasons, it seemed. It wasn't clear why people were being arrested and why some people weren't. And after November 9th and after, videos of like the police brutality went viral, after what happened at UC Davis with the crazy pepper spray cop, after so much negative publicity, and even after Chancellor Bergenau issued a statement saying that no students would face student conduct charges for their participation on November 9th, I think all of us kind of assume that, okay, well, that means that, there aren't going to be any kind of legal consequences or cases around this against anyone involved. Because in the past, the way that the UC has handled things is the DA has typically taken a step back. In other occupations and other demonstrations, when people have been arrested, the DA has decided, not to pursue charges in most cases, and oftentimes the UC has been the ones who, through their kind of student Office of Student Conduct, has proceeded, handling things on campus, thinking about suspension, community service, that type of thing. And so the fact that the UC wasn't going to be pursuing anything kind of made it, and because most of us weren't arrested, made us think that, okay, well, Occupy Cal, any repercussions from that are, there aren't going to be any. But in early March of 2012, I received a letter in the mail from the Alameda County District Attorney saying that a criminal complaint had been filed against me. It didn't say what complaint, it didn't say when or anything, and I actually assumed it was just kind of left over from when I was arrested on January 28th for move-in day, even though charges haven't been filed, but I just assumed that's what it was about. It wasn't until a couple of days later that I saw, on Facebook, a couple of really good friends of mine posting that they received criminal complaints for November 9th, and I was like, oh, I should probably call the DA and check and see, what complaint's been filed against me. And turns out that it was, it pertained to November 9th Occupy Cal. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I haven't been contacted by police. I had no idea I was under investigation. And then it soon turned out that 13 people had had charges filed against them, most of whom are pretty visible leaders, not leaders, but pretty visible activists on campus or organizers on campus. And the others were people that were, in a lot of the videos, it's very clear that they were really brutalized that day by police. One professor who has been very supportive of the struggle, but by no means, active in going to meetings and organizing all this stuff. She was not only hit, but when she gave herself up to police, was pulled to the ground by her hair. And so that raised a lot of questions for us. Why were 13 people out of hundreds being charged? What was what criteria was used to select people? Especially when you look around me, many other people who can probably be identified weren't receiving charges. Not to say that I think they should have, but it just raises a lot of questions of how things were, how people were selected and targeted, and raised suspicions among a number of people that these were politically motivated. Especially since I think only 4 out of the 13 of us who were charged were actually arrested that day. But again, only 4 out of the 40 people who were arrested that day are being charged. So it's just really, it's fascinating. Yeah.
So, what have you been able to get this? Or so, what were you charged? What were the consequences of you being charged?
Yeah, I mean, so my charge, the charges I face include misdemeanors of resisting arrest / blocking keeping a peace officer from, performing his or her duty. Okay, I wasn't resisting arrest. The only way I, blocked the passage or performance of blocked a peace officer that day was when my rib got in the way of an Alameda County Sheriff's baton, I guess. And then the second count was obstructing a thoroughfare, which, this all took place on the north lawn of Sproul Hall. I didn't know that was a thoroughfare. And the consequence, the charges themselves are pretty ridiculous, but things became more ridiculous when we all had our first hearings, and all of us except for the one professor charged received stay-away orders, which meant that we couldn't come within 100 yards of campus except to perform what the judge curiously termed the lawful business of the university, which, when asked for clarification, entailed, going to class, teaching class, and interestingly enough, performing work associated with our labor unions. So it was really fascinating and interesting. And so for about 2 weeks, we were all kept from campus. There were a number of demonstrations and rallies and pickets and phone calls and things written about the stay-away orders. And things written not just in the U.S. press, but also internationally. And eventually, the stay-away orders were lifted. So last week, 4 people had hearings early in the week, and the judge decided to, what they call, vacate the stay-away order. Then my lawyer went before a judge last Wednesday, also got the stay-away order, and now it's clear that, the stay-away orders will be lifted for everyone once they go before a judge, which is great. But the really important thing to note is the stay-away order pertained not just to UC Berkeley, but to all property belonging to the University of California. And when the district attorney was asked why that was, the district attorney responded saying, these people are known to travel to other UCs to protest at regents meetings and the like. Over during spring break, which was about a week and a half after the stay-away orders were first issued, was the spring meeting of the UC Regents at UC San Francisco. And over the past couple of years, every single UC Regents meeting has featured major protests. This year was no exception. And the fact that the stay-away orders were instituted right before a Regents meeting and lifted right after a Regents meeting, who knows? It's impossible to tell what went into the calculations for the stay-away orders. But, it's hard to tell. But it does raise suspicions, and it really kind of, at least in my opinion, is kind of clear evidence that dissent is being very much criminalized at the UC, and also in the Bay Area in general. I mean, you see stay-away orders also being issued against Occupy Oakland activists. They're banned from basically entering the downtown area. There have been many stay-away orders issued, and by the same district attorney's office. So there is, it's pretty apparent that the district attorney is looking to use judicial means to suppress dissent, and she actually is. She issued an editorial, I think in the Oakland Tribune or the San Francisco Chronicle, essentially saying exactly that she's going to use every means available to her and her office to basically take down Occupy Oakland. And so Occupy Cal, I guess, is seen as some extension of the Occupy movement. So,
do you think your future involvement will be affected by what's happened this month?
I mean, what happened, when dissent is criminalized in this way, whether trials ever happen, whether we're actually convicted, that's, oftentimes in these cases, I personally don't think that we're going to be convicted. I doubt we'll even have trials because the charges are so flimsy and the evidence is so, let's say, lame, or not lame, but just really weak. But what this does is, even when you're having to face trial, when you have charges brought against you, it does a couple of things. First of all, makes you scared to take part in any protest until, you're in the clear. So that means that, it really limits your ability to be involved in demonstrations, rallies, because if you get picked up by police and, arrests have been so arbitrary, and they've been, as January 28th prove. They're so willing to just kettle activists and arrest people for just, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. A lot of people arrested that day were just kind of passing through. There were people who had to leave their bikes unlocked, because they were just stuck in that block at the wrong time. So it makes you really scared to, go to rallies and demonstrations and, exercise your rights as a citizen of this country. It also is a huge, it takes away a lot of the time that you have to dedicate to going to meetings, to going to actions, to doing a lot of things, because you have to be meeting with your lawyers, you have to be meeting with other people that are accused. Luckily at Berkeley we've had huge support from people that weren't charged, who've been organizing a number of actions and events and writing a number of things. So we haven't had to do that work, which has been great. We have done some work, written things and gone to different events and everything. But, it becomes partly a distraction. It also takes up a lot of time, and it also really institutes a level of fear that just really, doesn't make you as willing or even as able to engage politically, for example, I would like to. But it is also a really awesome way for people to bring people together. And, a number of people who have been supportive of causes and have been, come to days of action, but maybe not necessarily come to meetings regularly, have really become more involved in, taking the lead on a number of events around the charges. And who knows, maybe that will translate to further involvement, more substantive involvement in the future. So, there's always silver linings in that way, but it is a giant pain.
Yeah. There seems to have been less news about Occupy lately. Why do you think that is?
The encampments are gone. Also, when winter came, this idea of doing outside occupations just doesn't really, it has a number of limits, one of which is, it's not conducive to winter weather, or winter weather is not conducive to it. And so, Occupy has not gone into hibernation, but, there has been kind of a lower level of engagement. People have been pursuing different projects. The great thing about Occupy is, a number of people have found each other, have become politically active in ways they probably didn't even think about or even think were possible last August, or even last September. And I know, a lot of people are involved in very different ways, less visible ways, less ways that are less interesting for the media, that really likes violence and people getting arrested and people getting beat and tear gas and all that stuff, but people are taking action in other ways that aren't necessarily as sensational or spectacular, but I think a lot of ways are much more important and substantive in the long run. And unfortunately the media doesn't like to cover that type of stuff, because it's not as, it doesn't make for, people, holding meetings, holding community barbecues, which have been going on in Oakland for the past 5 or 6 weeks. Those don't offer the same photo ops as, say, a big street fight between activists and protesters. So,
what are some of the other events that you see going on?
So there have been these community barbecues, which are awesome. There's been a number of different types of more kind of local attempts at organizing people locally in Oakland, in the Bay Area, for different reasons. There's one group that's formed called Occupy the Farm, which is looking at ways to, which is kind of embracing or trying to tackle food politics, trying to think of different ways to for people to grow their own food, to provide food, different types, better, less manufactured food to people who otherwise couldn't afford it or don't have grocery stores in their community that offer fresh produce and things like that. So there are interesting projects like that. People have become increasingly involved around organizing around all of the criminal cases that activists are facing stemming from Occupy. So there's been a lot of organization around that, what people call like anti-repression work. I know quite a few people who've become more involved in kind of prison abolition work. At UC Berkeley, there are a number of projects that people are tackling, ranging from kind of trying to gather signatures for the so-called millionaire's tax, which would, raise tax on people that make over $1 million, and a lot of that tax money would go straight to public education. Others are, organizing around things like admissions to the UC and some of the issues that are being raised. I mean, the admissions numbers are just coming out for the UC, and it's becoming increasingly clear that yet again underrepresented students, their numbers are being slashed at the UC. So people are trying to deal with that and organize in different ways. At UC Berkeley, a number of undergrads and grad students who have been really active on campus have decided to form a student political party for the student council elections, to create a student party that campaigns not just on, giving money to the Daily Cal and funneling money to sororities and I don't know what else, but, actually using it to fight for public education and maintain what we have. Grad students are really involved in, our own labor politics and our own status, our own precarious statuses, both students and workers on campus. So let's just say there's a ton of political projects, all of which I'd say are as important, as significant as, having an encampment in a big city. Yeah.
Do you think Occupy has been effective?
Yeah, effective, it depends what you mean by effective. I think it's done a lot. And accomplished a lot. It's changed the discourse in this country about wealth inequality, which is great. It's provided people a glimpse and experience with different forms of political engagement. So rather than voting every 2 to 4 years, people realize, actually I can, go to demonstrations, go to rallies, organize things, take part in different types of political work that I think has been really, really helpful and productive. I think it's allowed a lot of people to find each other, a lot of friendships to be made, a lot of relationships, both personal and political relationships to be forged, and which I think will lay the groundwork, or which has laid the groundwork for what I think is going to become a very, very big movement in this country and hopefully internationally against, various forms of exploitation and injustice. So I think that, what Occupy did, if it was effective, is effective in changing the discourse in this country, but also I think is probably a really good test run of things that are coming. So, yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No.
Great, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. From.